I was in Vietnam when the country celebrated its 50th anniversary of Reunification Day. That was April 30th, 2025. April 30th, 1975 is the day that Saigon fell, marking the end of the war in Vietnam involving the United States. It had been horrendous, lasting for over 10 years. More than 58,000 American service members died. The toll on this country was far greater. Estimates of the number of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed range from 970,000 to 3 million. Around 300,000 Cambodians and tens of thousands of Laotians also perished. Vietnam had been divided since 1954, the Communist North and the Democratic South. As the two sides clashed for control of a unified country, the United States joined on the side of the South. Ultimately, the North prevailed after support for the conflict withered in America and U.S. forces abandoned the fight. 50 years later, most of the scars here have healed, American-Vietnamese relations are strong, and U.S. tourists are enthusiastically welcomed. The war, however, has not been forgotten. I have been thinking a lot about the Vietnam War, or as it is known here, the American War, since I've been in the country. As someone who was alive during the conflict and who remembers the impact on my home country and the people around me, I suppose that is inevitable. Before I arrived in Vietnam, I wasn't planning on going to any locations that were associated with the war. Here I am, however, on a tour out of Hue to see a few of the sites which have historic ties to what happened. I wanted to bring you along. The first major stop on our tour was at the Quang Tri Ancient Citadel. Most sources say the battle that was fought here in the summer of 1972 was the longest and most fierce of the entire war. North Vietnamese forces captured the citadel, and the battle was an attempt by the South to retake it. The U.S. involvement was primarily in the form of airstrikes in support of South Vietnamese Marine and Airborne divisions. Fighting lasted for 81 days, with the American-backed forces finally achieving victory. The Citadel site today is a major stop for those visiting places that played a key role in the conflict. This is almost unbelievable. They told us to avoid this area that is behind me because they are still searching for landmines. It has been over 50 years since the most intense fighting took place here. In reality, those searching for explosives within the Citadel gave the all-clear 5 days before my visit. In 6 months, crews covered an area the size of 135,000 square meters. They removed 325 explosive devices that were classified as dangerous. During the primary fighting here, there was a great toll on both sides. Losses amongst the South Vietnamese were said to include well over 1,000 killed. Estimates for the number of North Vietnamese dead were far worse, with the number placed at over 8,000. This place now honors all of those who fell.
This is also the memorial, so when we go inside, we're going to burn incense stick to pay respect to the dead people in here.
Burning the incense is a nice touch for remembering what happened here. The numbers, however, are staggering, and being on this sacred ground is humbling. 20 Americans died in this fight. The U.S. fire support was catastrophic. It's said that over 20,000 bombs and artillery shells pounded the citadel each day during the battle. In all, an estimated 328,000 metric tons of ordnance were directed toward the 3-square-kilometer site. You wonder how anything could survive such heavy bombardment. How intense was the fighting at this location? It was a fairly sizable citadel. This brick wall is all the remains of what was here when the war began. Locals consider this as spiritual land because of the blood and bones that permeate the soil. As I was leaving, I encountered numerous individuals, mainly women, in green uniforms. My guide says that signifies they used to serve in the military. Relations between Vietnam and the U.S. have come so far in 50 years. Our next stop was across the country near the border with Laos. This is the Khe Sahn Combat Base, used by American forces during the war. It was a Marine outpost in the mid-1960s, after having been established by Special Forces in 1962. This was another site, which was the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the conflict. The Battle of Khe Sahn began just after the first of the year in 1968. 2 to 3 division-sized groups of the People's Army of Vietnam from the north laid siege to the base where 2 regiments of U.S. Marines were stationed. The North Vietnamese attacked the base here at Khe Sahn about a month before the Tet Offensive. The battle lasted for 77 days. 6,000 Marines held out against the attacking force of nearly 20,000. A U.S. bombing campaign kept the base from being overrun, and eventually a relief expedition broke through and repelled the offensive. Over 1,000 American servicemen were killed at Khe Sahn and in the operations to liberate them. Total casualties among those fighting for the North are unknown, but thought to be much higher. Both sides claimed victory here. Not long after the battle, in July of 1968, the U.S. pulled Marines from the combat base. The Americans abandoned this place and went to put their resources elsewhere. Today, Khe Sahn is open to the public. There are displays that try to tell the story of what happened, including a small museum. It's possible to walk over a portion of the former base and put together all of the pieces. It is helpful to have a guide.
Where we are right now, the second runway belongs to South Vietnam. The first runway belonged to the U.S. over there.
The runway built by the Americans was dismantled as they left, but a small portion of the steel surface remains under the static display of a C-130 Hercules. Other aircraft and pieces of hardware are featured on the grounds. That includes both Huey and Chinook helicopters. There is also an M61 tank, plus an armored personnel carrier. The recreation of a bunker complex made the biggest impression on me. Seeing the type of environment where Marines were pinned down for well over 2 months provided just a small sense of what they endured. Imagine spending so much time in these spaces and navigating amongst them through these trenches. No doubt it must have been a terrifying existence during those 77 days. This tour stopped at 4 major sites, places that were key locations during the American-Vietnam War. There were other elements too, though. Our route took us over a road that originally existed as part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There were also a few moments on Highway 1, which was known as the Horror Highway. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians were among those killed on the stretch between Hue and Quang Tri. We did a drive-by of the Long Hung Church, which sustained major damage in the Easter Offensive in 1972. Likewise, we made a couple of passes of the Daang Museum Bridge, which was destroyed and rebuilt numerous times during the war. Outside of the tour, I went on my own to several war-related sites. Chief among those was the Daang Museum. Located just a few steps from the Han River, the museum features displays about the city from prehistory until today. A fair portion of the space is devoted to the war. Much of the emphasis here is on the role of Da Nang in the conflict and how those who lived in the city reacted to what was going on around them. A major U.S. air base was situated in the vicinity, and there are artifacts and photos remembering the American involvement in the local area. The beaches of Da Nang were key in the war for a couple of reasons. American service members used the city and its position on the East Sea as a place for R&R, or rest and relaxation. Even before that, however, this part of the coast had a great deal of significance. The first major U.S. combat unit arrived in Vietnam right here in Da Nang. The specific location is just a few kilometers from here. That was in March of 1965. Now a full 60 years ago. 2,000 members of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade landed on the sand with the mission of defending the nearby air base. They were the first of more than 2.5 million Americans to serve in Vietnam during the war. The Marble Mountains are situated on the south side of Da Nang. There was a Marble Mountain air station nearby used by U.S. helicopters. The natural caves and tunnels of the mountains, though, were used by the Viet Cong. They set up temporary bases there and even used some of the space for a hospital. In Hue, a little farther north along the coast, there is the Imperial City. Because of its history, U.S. forces were directed to avoid targeting the site. During the Tet Offensive, however, in early 1968, North Vietnamese troops occupied the complex. As fighting in the Battle of Hue intensified, the prohibition against using bombs and artillery against the site was lifted. Structures suffered significant damage. At the Tien Mo Temple and Pagoda outside of Hue, there is another element with a connection to the war. This car is on display at the site. It was used to drive a Buddhist monk to Saigon in 1963, where he set himself on fire in protest of the South Vietnamese government. That, in part, led the United States to back the attempt to overthrow the president, and American involvement continued from there. Back on the tour, our next stop was in the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone. Specifically, we visited the Hien Luong Bridge. Crossing the Bin Hai River, this was a connection that people didn't use for years. A white line in the middle of the span marks the border between what was North and South Vietnam. Many people now walk across the entire 165-meter-long bridge, remembering the significance of the divide. This is right along the 17th parallel, which was established as the border between the two parts of the country back in 1954. The river was just the center of the demilitarized zone. It extended for as much as 10 kilometers on each side and as little as 5 kilometers on each side. Of course, when the war broke out, it was no longer demilitarized. In fact, it's said that American bombs destroyed the bridge in 1967. After that, various measures were used to span the river during the war. This historically accurate bridge was built in 2003. Today, there are monuments on each side of the river recognizing the separation, but most importantly, celebrating reunification. That monument on the north bank takes the form of a giant flag on top of a round pedestal. The pedestal carries images of wartime and the celebrations which followed reunification. This site appears to be a source of great national pride for the people of Vietnam. On the north side of the bridge as well, there is a small museum. It contains many of the usual trappings of war, photographs, and figures depicting scenes from those days. As in so many places, there is also a statue of Ho Chi Minh. Originally, the DMZ and the divide between North and South was supposed to be in place on a temporary basis, and the country would be united peacefully 2 years later. We all know the history now. The separation lasted for more than 2 decades. The final stop on our tour was a remarkable place. This is the location of the Vinh Moc tunnels. In this spot, villagers seeking shelter from U.S. bombing went underground. Digging in the soft but sturdy limestone began in 1965 and continued for a couple of years. The result is an impressive subterranean network into which people could escape when ordnance started to fall. The tunnel system is 3 levels deep, and it goes down as deep as 23 meters. It's amazing because more than 1,000 people could be housed in this tunnel in case of attack. In total, the length of the tunnels extends for about 2 kilometers. There are 7 entrances on the hilltops and 6 portals facing the East Sea. Today, it's possible to walk through sections of the complex. There were even points at which I was able to stand upright, and I am over 6 feet tall. Quang Tri province was the most heavily bombed part of Vietnam during the war. The village here was targeted often because the U.S. learned of efforts by the residents to supply North Vietnamese soldiers. These tunnels proved to be effective, as it's claimed that none of the people who lived here died in the conflict. More than a dozen babies were born inside of the tunnels during the war years. We met one of those individuals outside of an entrance to the underground area. He is now 53 years old. This site shows the resilience and determination of people in the face of unbelievable conditions. The entire tour allowed me to connect the land which today I visit as a welcome guest to the horrors of a conflict from 2 generations ago. I feel for all of those who suffered, from combatants on both sides to the regular people whose world was upended when fighting came to their doorstep. This tour has been a solemn affair for me. America's involvement in the war ended long before I could have been called to serve. My 2 older brothers, however, were both in the impacted age group, but neither came to Vietnam. Life could have been altered greatly for my family with a change in circumstances. This video has not been fun, but I think the subject matter is important. I'm glad I decided to spend time learning more about the history. Thank you for staying with me to the end here on Old, Alone, and Far From Home.